Picture a man named Quan. He's old, he's clever, and he's sitting in a small room lined literally from floor to ceiling with worn, dusty books. It's late fall, there's this bitter chill hanging in the air, and Quan is shivering. But it's not just the cold making his hands shake. His belly is grumbling. He is completely starving.
The early frosts have already swept through and killed off all the wild greens Quan usually gathers just to survive. So, totally out of options, he's walking the dirt paths of the local market in quiet desperation. He stops by the stall of a wealthy merchant. He looks left, he looks right, and with one single, shaky hand, he reaches out and grabs a handful of raw rice.
"Stop! Thief!" That ringing shout just echoes through the busy market. Suddenly, the gleaming, sharp edge of a guard's sword is pointed directly at Quan's throat. He freezes. He frantically holds out the rice, his hands just trembling, desperately trying to hand it back.
Before he knows it, Quan is dragged into a cold, echoing courtroom. The judge barely even glances up from his heavy wooden desk. He simply slaps Quan with a fine, 10 copper coins. Quan's mouth just falls wide open. It's an impossible sum. 10 copper coins? That could feed him for months. Since his pockets are completely empty, two burly guards grab Quan right by the arms. They physically drag him away from the bright light of the courtyard and dump him, entirely unceremoniously, onto a rough straw pallet inside a damp, underground stone cell.
Down there, time just loses its meaning. At first, there's only this tiny window near the high ceiling, casting one single sliver of light on the bare stone walls. Then comes the harsh, lingering smell of the bathroom bucket sitting over in the corner. And finally, his first meal arrives. It's just wormy scraps swimming in a damp paper bowl.
That awful food keeps his body alive, sure. But Quan's real starvation isn't in his belly anymore. It's in his spirit. He sits there in the damp dark, intensely craving the familiar smell of his books. He just aches for the lively, bustling conversations of the temple he used to visit.
Then, one afternoon, a passing bird perches right on the ledge of that tiny, high window. It drops a small, gnarled plum pit down onto the stone floor. Quan moves a bit too fast. The sudden noise startles the bird, and it soars away into the distance. Staring up at that empty patch of sky, Quan feels heavier and more trapped than ever before. But slowly, his eyes drift back down to the floor.
How exactly does a desperate man get himself out of a stone tomb? Well, Quan refuses to let this dark prison carry him to his grave. He takes a deep breath in, he turns inward, he picks up the gnarled pit from the dust, stares at it for a really long, quiet moment, and then, at the top of his lungs, he calls out for the guard.
The heavy iron door creaks open. The guard steps in with a harsh sneer, her sword already half drawn, but she stops dead in her tracks. Quan is just sitting there, perfectly calm. He tells her, without a single tremor in his voice, that he possesses a magic gift, a gift left for him by a lucky spirit.
"If I'm lying, I'd be executed," Quan says evenly. "Why would I take that chance?" It is a massive, incredibly high-stakes bluff. The guard just stares at him. Slowly, her grip loosens on her scabbard. She decides to drag him up from the dark, all the way into the royal quarters.
The visual contrast is almost blinding. Quan is now standing in an intricately carved throne room. The air is thick with the smell of sweet incense and rich wood. It is completely packed with a crowd of proud officials, and right at the center sits the broad, imposing king, flanked by his ambassador, his general, and his prime minister.
The king leans forward, his voice booming out through the grand hall. "Share your gift or face the axe." Quan doesn't flinch. Slowly, lovingly, he reaches deep into his pocket and pulls out a pale white origami ball, one he carefully folded from his damp prison paper bowls.
Quan gently unfolds the paper. Inside rests that same gnarled plum pit. He looks up at the wondering court and boldly claims this tiny seed will grow solid gold plums. But there is a condition. It will only bear gold if it is planted by someone who is completely pure, someone who has never stolen or cheated.
So, who in that room is pure enough to plant it? A low murmur instantly ripples through the packed court. Quan offers it directly to the king. The king looks down at the seed, shakes his head sadly, and admits out loud to the gasping crowd that he actually stole a knife from his father when he was a young boy.
Quan immediately pivots over to the ambassador.
The ambassador blusters, stammers, and physically backs away from the pit, because in the quiet of his own mind, he's remembering the heavy bribes he secretly took just to whisper favorable suggestions into the king's ear. Next, Quan turns the seed toward the general. The general doesn't even speak. He just stares straight down at his leather boots in sudden shame. He is haunted by the phantom clinking of copper coins, coins that were meant to feed his own soldiers, which he entirely wasted away at the gambling tables.
Finally, Quan turns to the famously honest Prime Minister, but as he holds out the pit, her face flushes a deep, burning red. She shakes her head, hiding her own long history of quietly accepting bribes over the years. Not a single person in that entire grand room steps forward.
10 copper coins for rice, and still you steal. The silence is suddenly shattered by Quan. He starts to laugh, just uncontrollable, echoing laughter at the sight of their pale, terrified faces. He points at their heavy, silken pockets, and then holds up his own empty hands, mimicking his desperate grasp for a handful of market rice. A heavy, incredibly embarrassed silence falls back over the grand room as the laughter finally dies down. The king slowly sits up straight on his carved throne. He licks his dry lips. He signals his serving man and quietly orders a collection to be made. A small leather purse is brought forth and quietly passed around the room. One by one, it is sheepishly filled by the very officials who were just too afraid to touch the seed. Finally, the purse reaches the throne, and the king himself reaches in, adding 10 copper coins of his own.
The king cinches the heavy bag tight and tosses it through the air right to Quan. His fine is officially paid, he is free to go. But the king points a finger at the tiny pit still resting in Quan's hand. It will stay here in my quarters and serve as a reminder.
Old, clever Quan doesn't argue for a second. He reaches out, his hands no longer shaking at all. He takes the heavy leather purse, and right on the edge of the royal throne, he quietly leaves the gnarled, unplanted seed behind.
The heavy wooden doors open up. Quan strolls right out of the palace courtyard. He whistles a light, easy tune into the crisp autumn air, stepping back onto the dirt path headed toward his dusty shelves of books. And swinging gently at his side is a very heavy leather purse.